Okay, so today we're going to start talking about the origins of World War II, in particular, the neutrality of the United States. So this is chapter 10, lesson 2. See our page numbers right here. So here we have a couple of images that reflect kind of what we're talking about here. We have this term Lend-Lease Act, which we'll discuss and find out what that means. We see the flags of the countries that were fighting against Germany, Italy, Japan during World War II. And we see a tank here being dropped like on a parachute. We see Uncle Sam here reading a book that's How to Be Neutral, which is a really important debate that happens. And then we have here this argument for neutrality, demand no convoys of ships and no war, right? One of the goals of some people was for the United States to stay out of World War II. All right, so let's talk about American neutrality and why America was remaining neutral. So, first of all, the United States was what's called isolationist. That means that they didn't really want to get involved in world affairs because they wanted to stay out of another world war. Remember, World War One had only happened, 15 years before, and so they didn't want to have that same situation again. So we have the Nye Committee here, which is a congressional committee made up of members of Congress, and they investigated what happened with World War One. And one of the things they really focused on was how much money the different arms dealers and manufacturers made, all the companies that made the tanks, that made the chemical weapons, that made all the equipment for the war, how much they profited, how much money they made during the war. And so there was a trend among some Americans to kind of blame the arms dealers that they're the ones that that encouraged war because they saw there's an opportunity to make money. So they didn't want to have that same situation happen again. So while tensions in Europe are rising with, Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, and then in Asia with Japan invading China and Manchuria, Congress passes some laws called Neutrality Acts, and they kind of have three different ones: 1935, 36, and 37. And each one is kind of like aim to keep the country neutral, but kind of also kind of confront some of the new issues that occurred. So in 1935, it was illegal for Americans to sell weapons to any country at war. So Italy and Germany were acting kind of aggressive in Europe, and so it was kind of this affected them. And then in 1936, Congress updates the Neutrality Act to say, okay, you can't even loan money to countries at war. So, like for example, the United States couldn't loan money to Britain or to Poland or to Czechoslovakia, to help them fight Italy and Germany. It was really a way to kind of like clamp down on any kind of assistance to get the U.S. involved into a conflict in Europe. So in 1937, there was a slight change here. The Neutrality Act of 1937 is sometimes known as cash and carry. It's called cash and carry because it allowed the United States to sell non-military supplies to other countries. So countries like Britain, France, those kinds of places, ones that were opposed to what Germany and Italy were doing. But the condition was the money had to be paid for in cash. They had to pay for it up front. They couldn't borrow money. They couldn't get a loan or anything like that, or put on credit or anything like that. And then they had to pick it up using their own ships. So the U.S. would not deliver it. And the idea behind this was it was designed to avoid the possibility of a U.S. ship being sunk, kind of like with the Lusitania in World War One. So you'll see these neutrality acts kind of updating here. Now, what we see is a contrast between what Congress is doing, they're passing these laws, and what President Franklin Roosevelt wants to do, right? He doesn't veto the Neutrality Acts because as president he could do that. He signs them, but he kind of reluctantly, he saw Germany as a big threat in Europe, and he believed in what's called internationalism. This is the idea that the more trade you have, the more connections you have around the world, the more peaceful things will be. And when isolationism can lead to more conflict because people think you're staying out of it, then it leaves them the opportunity to do things that they wouldn't normally do if they had relationships. And so Franklin Roosevelt does kind of ignore the Neutrality Act of 1937, the cash and carry one. He supplies weapons to China after Japan invades China. And he ignores it because he says this only applies to what's happening in Europe. So we see this conflict here between what Congress wants, which is neutrality, and what Franklin Roosevelt wants. He wants the U.S. to be a little bit more aggressive here. We see a couple of cartoons here. We see this person is reading a kind of a bedtime story to kids, and they look kind of scared. And this is Dr. Seuss, who made this cartoon, and he has a label here, America First. This was a isolationist group that really didn't want America to get involved. And we see here reading the story of Adolf the Wolf, right? It's about Hitler and what he's doing in Europe. And it says, and the wolf chewed up children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter, right? So this idea that America First was saying, like, what happens in Europe is kind of their business. It doesn't affect us, so we need to stay out of it. On the other side, we have this cartoon here. We have a boat. And on the boat, it says aid that will win. So basically, supplies that will help win this war and conflict going on in Europe. And we have the Neutrality Act here, this old man here, and his beard is tying the ship and preventing the ship from sailing, right? And it's like, so in other words, the old man of the sea here, like that's a reference to a book. But this is saying, that the Neutrality Act is holding aid back from Europe that would help them in this conflict with Hitler and Mussolini. And make it so that they could be defeated. Okay, so neutrality is tested here. So we have another Neutrality Act. This is in 1939. This one is known as cash and carry. Okay, it's in a continuation of cash and carry. Excuse me, but it expanded to allow the sale of weapons. So it wasn't just non-military supplies. Now you could sell weapons, but again, the same rules applied. Pay cash. They had to pick it up themselves. Okay. FDR tries to find some ways around these restrictions of the Neutrality Acts. One of the things he does is he arranges this destroyers for bases deal, right? FDR sends these 50 older destroyer-less ships to Britain in exchange for the use of British military bases in the Atlantic Ocean. But it's not a sale, so it's not selling them weapons. It's just a trade, right? And so he argues that cash and carry doesn't apply here, right? So, but it did give Britain some much needed military aid here. And so he's trying to get around the Neutrality Acts here. And this action was pretty popular among Americans. And so what this was showing is that maybe people didn't want to be isolationist anymore. They saw there was a need for American involvement. And so you have this America First Committee, who I mentioned earlier. And Charles Lindbergh, you might remember him as the first person to fly across the Atlantic. He was a very prominent member of the America First Committee. They opposed any involvement in Europe. So in 1940, FDR is reelected to a third term. So after he's reelected, and that, by the way, that's a new record. No president has ever been elected 3 times. And so FDR made a speech to Congress called the Four Freedoms Speech, in which he listed these 4 essential freedoms, or kind of the core values. And he argued they were shared between the U.S. and Britain. This idea of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, both things in the Constitution. But he also talked about this idea of freedom from want, which is the right of people to feel safe in their countries and to be healthy and not have these threat of war kind of taking away their safety. And also this idea of freedom from fear. In the Great Depression, 10 years before or so, Franklin Roosevelt had made a fireside chat speech in which he's talked about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So it kind of echoes this idea that people have a right to not be afraid of what's going to happen. Okay, so FDR is kind of laying out these kind of important values of the United States. So Congress kind of starts to agree with FDR that there needs to be something done about Europe. And so we have the Lend-Lease Act here. But they weren't quite ready for the U.S. to kind of fully jump in here. And so this is after 1940. So at this time, the Battle of Britain is going on. The war has actually begun in Europe after Hitler invades Poland. So the Lend-Lease Act basically says the U.S. could lend or rent weapons to any country vital to the defense of the United States, right? But there was no Navy protection for the cargo ships because they didn't want American ships to be in harm's way. They didn't want them to be sunk. Right. So it was direct assistance, and it didn't kind of reverses the cash and carry. Right. All right. In August of 1941, Churchill and FDR, we see the two of them here, FDR here on the left, Churchill here on the right. They reach this agreement called the Atlantic Charter. And this basically shows, first of all, the personal relationship between Churchill and FDR, but also between the two countries of Britain and the United States. They share what's called a special relationship. They share a common history, language, some cultural things, right? So there's a tight relationship between the two countries, and including this ideas of democracy, freedom, and peace. And so this Atlantic Charter really shows the US and Britain moving closer to an alliance. And so we start to see an increased tension between American ships in the Atlantic and German submarines. Okay. So we see here these uh, paintings. These are by Norman Rockwell, a pretty famous American artist, who made these things showing the four freedoms that Roosevelt talked about: freedom of speech, standing up and saying what you believe; freedom of worship; freedom of religion, right? Freedom from want. We see like a Thanksgiving dinner where everybody's got plenty of food and stuff, and freedom from fear. We see these parents kind of tucking their child in at night so they feel safe. So neutrality is really kind of tested. By August of 1941, the US is kind of inching closer to getting involved in the war. So we end here with Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. This is the key event which brings the United States fully into war. Um, Before Pearl Harbor happened, so in 1940, the U.S. is starting to restrict the sale of goods to Japan because they see how aggressive they're being. So they're trying to limit the sale of gas and oil and iron, important things for building a military, right? Japan also signs this alliance with Germany and Italy. So now they have a military alliance. So, like, if one is attacked, then they all kind of will be joining together. The United States is sending supplies to China, and Japan continues to be aggressive in Asia, right? And the U.S. is freezing Japanese assets, right? So, like, money and goods that Japan is not able to access anymore. So Pearl Harbor, what happens is the U.S. government kind of knew an attack was going to happen, but they thought it might be like in the Philippines or something like that, but not in Hawaii because that was too far from Japan. But Japan had kind of launched this secret surprise attack on December 7th, 1941. Just a few days before that, some Japanese government officials were negotiating with President Roosevelt about these sanctions and the restrictions on sale of goods. So it kind of was a surprise, and the idea was to knock out America's navy before the war started, so that Japan could take over the Pacific Ocean, basically. So 18 ships were sunk or damaged, 2,400 Americans killed, right? And this was kind of a thing that kind of made the country want to go to war immediately. FDR calls it a day that will live in infamy. Infamy means kind of like famous, but in a bad way. And so Congress declared war on Japan. You can see the vote here. 82 senators to 0 voted for war. In the House of Representatives, 388 voted yes, and only one person voted no. Jeanette Rankin, she's the first female member of Congress. She was the only person to vote no on going to war in World War II because she was a pacifist, somebody who opposed all war. Okay. But even though the United States declared war against Japan, its major focus was still on Germany and Europe because FDR saw Germany as the biggest threat. And because Germany and Italy were part of the Axis powers, they had this alliance with Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the US on December 11th. So that's how kind of the United States became involved in both World War II in Europe and in the Pacific against Japan. We see some picture here of all the smoke and stuff from the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the big headline on the New York Times, right? This is a major, major event. All right, so let's talk about terms and people to know. I mentioned a lot of these so far. So cash and carry, again, this is this idea that any country at war could only buy non-military supplies, so no weapons, so food and that sort of thing, but they had to pick up the supplies themselves and pay cash. Okay. Isolationism, which was kind of Congress's emphasis, at least in the 1930s, this idea of avoiding alliances and a way to avoid going to war, having conflicts. The America First Committee, this was an organization that opposed any U.S. involvement in European conflicts. A lot of prominent members in America, including Charles Lindbergh, they were really opposed to any kind of efforts to get involved in Europe. And there were some connections to anti-Semitism, which means anti-Jewish. So, some like people like Charles Lindbergh, they were more friendly to Hitler, right? They met with Hitler. Charles Lindbergh accepted a medal from Hitler. So the America First Committee has not gotten a great reputation in the years since then. The Lend-Lease Act, this was a law that's supported by FDR where Congress started to change its perspective, where the country like Britain could get weapons from the United States, but the United States was still officially neutral. Okay. And then this idea, a day that will live in infamy. This is one of the most famous quotes in American history. It's from a speech by Franklin Roosevelt that refers to Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That's the day that he refers to. Okay, so that's how the United States gets involved into World War One, and we have this tension between Congress with its neutrality and FDR wanting to get involved.